The expulsion of Jews from Western Europe and the movement east is the theme of our third installment of Jews in the Middle Ages. There were a series of papal bulls throughout the Middle Ages, papal enactments, which brought pressure upon the Jews. Starting in the 1200s, Honorius III obligated Jews to carry a distinctive badge, and Jews could not hold public office. Gregory IX in 1239 ordered the seizure of the Talmud and its burning. Benedict XIII in 1415 made a whole collection of anti-Jewish church legislation that inspired other popes. And Martin V in 1425 obligated Jews to wear a special badge. 1442, Jews could not live with Christians. And of course, 1482, Ferdinand of Aragon, the King of Spain, appointed inquisitors to root out heresy. And these led to the systematic expulsion of Jews from almost every country in Western Europe. And you see here from our map, England in 1290, Hungary in 1349, and then again in 1360, France 1394, Austria 1421, Lithuania 1495, Portugal, Spain 1492, Spain 1497, Naples 1510, and so on, as we see from the map here. So where did Jews go? What was their destination? Now, already in the 1200s, as we see here on the right, Jews had been invited to Poland. The 1264, the Statute of Kalisz, established Jewish liberties in Poland, and that they are subject to the king or the duke, who actually would protect them. And in 1334, King Casimir extends the statute throughout Poland and invites Jews to move there. And the Poles understood that the Jews could be a great asset to their country. And so in 1348, additional waves of Jews arrived fleeing the Black Plague, and Poland in Hebrew is Polan, here we live. And it was for over 500 years, really the center of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. By the time you arrive at the Holocaust, there are 3 million Jews. Now, we talked about how in the 1200s, there were 20 to 30,000 Jews in Western Europe. So how did you get from that number to 3 million? Now, there are those who want to suggest a theory, and it's based upon the Kingdom of Khazaria, which is in southern Russia, above the Black Sea, and what today would be Ukraine and parts of Russia and parts to the east. And we know from a famous book written a few hundred years later by Rabbi Judah Halevi, the Kuzari, it depicts the scenario of the king of Khazar seeking the true religion. So he calls in a rabbi, a priest, an imam, sounds like a joke, right? And a philosopher to present him the truth. And after the first few pages, they all fall away but the rabbi. And the rest of the volume is the rabbi presenting Judaism. Now, it was based on historical events of the king of Khazaria and perhaps some or most of his kingdom converting to Judaism. Now, you don't hear about this much because the Russians are not so keen to advertise the fact that the beginnings of the Russian kingdom converted to Judaism. And we have some archaeological evidence of this as well. However, more recently, this has been used as a positioning that really European Jews came from the Khazars and were white Caucasians. And therefore, since we are not Semites, you see the political implications. The return to Zion is really a colonialist enterprise. not an indigenous people returning to its roots. Now, more recently, DNA studies have shown that Jewish DNA, even for European Ashkenazi Jews, is closer to that of Middle East Semitic populations than to the European population. So really, it's exponential growth that drove this incredible population surge. So by the time you get to the 1400s, the Jewish population in Eastern Europe is starting to grow, and it really flourished from there, at least for the first few hundred years. The movement to Russia by the 19th century became more questionable because of the anti-Semitism of many of the czars. Now, the culmination of the expulsion really was from Spain, where there was this great Spanish Jewish community that we've talked about. And by the 15th century, the Christian reconquest of Spain was complete. And so when the Pope issued his bull, Ferdinand and Isabella issued an absolute decree that Jews had to either convert or leave Spain or be executed. And for the 100 years before that, the Inquisition was persecuting Jews, rooting out heresy, and even amongst the newly converted Jews, they were attacked. 1492, the day before Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, Christopher Columbus set out to find new lands, and his crew, we know, and possibly even he, were Jewish, and this was a response to the expulsion. Many Jews moved to Portugal, but not for long. They would be expelled from there. So where did they go? So the two destinations are going to be, three destinations are going to be Holland, which was a much more open society religiously, Italy, where in 1437, Cosimo Medici in Florence invited the Jews to come to Florence. And for 150 years, the Florentine society was very open to Jews. However, by 1571, the Medicis imposed a ghetto, Jews to live in a specific neighborhood and were not allowed outside of it. Another destination which proved to be very significant was the Ottoman Empire in 1492. Bayezid II, the king of the Ottoman Empire, invites the Jews to come settle in Turkey. And as we said, they all understood how Jews were an asset. Jews had an international trade network with a common language of Hebrew and a banking system based upon trust and a handshake, which greatly enhanced the trade of any country that they were living in. And in fact, there are those who point out that the Spanish Empire, which dominated the world at the time, quickly started to diminish after the expulsion, very possibly due to the Jewish brain drain and Jewish business that had left. Now, as a result of the invitation into the Ottoman Empire, Jews would be invited into not just Turkey, but Israel as well, which was under the Ottoman Empire. And this saw an incredible flourishing of Jewish life in Israel, particularly in the northern town of Sfat, and particularly, but not exclusively, amongst the study and the teaching of Kabbalah, which would have an impact upon the next 500 years of Jewish history. So in the 1500s, you have the great Rabbi Isaac Luria, who received new Kabbalistic teachings. His student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, who wrote them down, and his son, who disseminated them. You have Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, who wrote Lacha Dodi, the Kabbalat Shabbat song that we sing every Friday night. And you see here the picture of the cemetery in Sfat before it was built up, the tomb of the Ari of Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, and nearby the tomb of Rabbi Joseph Caro, who not just was a Kabbalist, but who wrote the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, which became the standard for Jewish law from that point on. So this was an incredible creative period which led to the disseminating of Jewish mystical and Kabbalistic teachings and their integration into all areas of Jewish life. And here you have some of the beautiful synagogues, which you can go visit in Sfat, the Abu Haf synagogue. And in that synagogue, you can find a Torah from the Spanish expulsion in pre-1492 that was carried there and is still to be found in the Ark. Now, in Italy, the Jews of the had an impact upon the Renaissance. And there are those who want to suggest that, in fact, even before the Spanish expulsion, the Jews in Spain were accessing the Greek classics through the Muslim translations, translating them in through the Arabic translations, translating them into Hebrew, and passing them on to some of their comrades, colleagues in Italy, who then translated them into Italian, and then they were disseminated, helping jumpstart the Italian Renaissance. And some of the key figures of the Renaissance had very interesting Jewish ties as well. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, no image of Jesus, and highlighting the Jewish prophets and kings. And here's a depiction of God creating Adam and the outstretched fingers, but not touching, which is very much the Jewish view that we seek the Almighty but cannot unify with the divine. And Michelangelo is documented to have studied with rabbis and been very drawn towards Torah and Rabbinic teachings, and was clearly a Philo-Semite. There's a whole book written on it by Rabbi Blech, Sistine Chapel and the Jews. A new development, which is just in the last 5 years, was that Leonardo da Vinci's origins were always a matter of rumor and debate. Some saying his mother was an Arab, and some saying she was a Jew. Carlo Vecchi, the top biographer of Leonardo da Vinci, set out to disprove these rumors, and in fact came out after years of research stating unequivocally that Leonardo da Vinci's mother was a Circassian Jewish slave who was sold several times, eventually wound up in Florence, and was taken in by Da Vinci, his father, and who fell in love with her, freed her, and they had their son Leonardo, the greatest mind of the Renaissance and of perhaps hundreds of thousands of years since then. So another Renaissance innovation, which had a great impact upon Judaism, was the advent of the printing press. And David Bromberg, who actually was not Jewish, was very connected to the rabbinic community, and he would publish the Torah and the Talmud in 1517, jumpstarting the dissemination of Jewish texts. And we spoke about the Medicis, who invited the Jews in and saw a period of great flourishing of Jews integrated into Renaissance society in Italy. Jews in Holland also had a great creative productivity. Their presence produced a very key figure in the history of philosophy, Spinoza, who was not embraced by the Jewish scholarly rabbinic world. And he, in a sense, was one of the steps towards the beginning of modernism, redefining his understanding of God to be more a God of nature than a God of history. and was rejected by the Jewish community, but his impact would be great. Now, another stopping point from Western to Eastern Europe was Prague, the Czech Republic. And in the 1500s would see the rise of a great figure, the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy of Prague, a great philosopher, mystic, and he would also be the subject of a myth, of the story of the golem, of a supernatural being that he created who protected the Jewish people. And it seems that the actual written accounts of those stories only surfaced in the late 19th century, leading some to question their veracity. But the Maharal was a great figure in Central Europe and of the time. Yet at the same time, for all the Jewish flourishing of Jewish life, there was also anti-Semitism and conflict. And here we see a picture of the Charles Bridge. The crucifix on it is right in the middle, and apparently the story was that a Jew was walking by. He was accused of spitting on it, and so the Jewish community was levied a tax that they would have to collect enough gold to write in the Hebrew, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Sfakot, and put it around the crucifix as a humiliation for the Jews. And it is still standing here to this day, once again, with a plaque showing this an example of the anti-Semitism. We should also add that throughout the time, there were papal decrees protecting the Jews. Sometimes it was the mobs who were more insidious than the actual church authorities, yet we showed that the teachings of the church led to these outbursts of terrible persecution. By the 1500s, Jewish life in Poland flourished, and one of the great figures of Polish Jewry was the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who wrote the Ashkenazic inserts to the Code of Jewish Law of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He lived in Krakow from 1530 to 1572, a great Jewish enlightened figure, a great philosopher, a great legalist, and a great communal leader, and one can visit the synagogue, his synagogue there to this day. And so you have a flourishing of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, along with terrible moments of persecution. The Chelmeniki massacres were an invasion of Eastern Cossacks coming into Russia and Poland, and according to some, up to a third of the Jewish population would have been killed at the time. And this led to terrible suffering on behalf of the Jewish people. The estimates are from 100 to 300,000 Jews were slaughtered, and they were attacking the Polish nobility and the Polish authorities, and the Jews were seen as part of that infrastructure. And the aftermath of that suffering, some years later, you had the rise of a false messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, and which also led to terrible suffering of Jews' messianic hopes being stoked, only to find out that after he was arrested by the Turkish Sultan for wanting to bring Jews back to Israel, he then, after being thrown in prison, converted to Islam. Some of his followers would not let go of their belief in him as the Messiah, even after he died. And so you have, once again, the mixed story of Jewish flourishing, of Jewish life, particularly Jewish scholarly teachings, of study and teaching of the Torah, of the writing of great volumes of Torah, and yet at the same time, life was very difficult. And this sets the scene for the beginning of modernity, which will offer new opportunities for Jews, but will also pose new challenges, and that will be for our next installment.